Hello, everyone. Before I start my talk, as I'm a scientist, I would like to begin with a scientific experiment with all of you. Therefore, I would need a little bit light in the hall. And please dim this one for a second. I need to see the audience. My question to you is, how stressed did you feel within the past 7 days in average, between your professional duties, your private affairs, and the environmental challenges? I will walk you through a scale of 1 to 10. 1 means totally relaxed, and 10 means absolutely stressed, peak stress. I will count through from 1 to 10, and I ask you to raise your hands whenever you think now is the rating, the score that applies to you best. And can you please dim this for a second, because I cannot see anyone. Well, see how it goes. So, I start. How stressed were you within the past 10 days? 1. Very relaxed audience here. 2. 3. 4. Okay, gets more serious. 5. 6. 7. 8. Wow. This whole portion there. 9. And 10. Thank you, you're courageous. So, for those among you who scored 5 or higher, can you please raise your hand if you live if you live in a city larger than 100,000 inhabitants? Wow, okay. So this is going to be your talk now. Stress and the city. Now, the question is, do cities drive us mad? Do they stress us out? The answer is yes. In a way, they do. But on the other side, they're also good for us. They're also good for our emotional well-being. They provide education, all the possibilities for individual development and personal freedom. But our brains are not well designed for living in the densely and overcrowded metropolises of our world. It's quite plausible to all of us that city living is somehow associated with increased stress exposure. And it also does not need many explanations to understand that stress impacts our health and well-being. Now, can I get to the next slide? Okay, great. It's been known for a while in medicine that some of the major psychiatric diseases are more frequent in cities. For example, schizophrenia. The risk for schizophrenia is twice as high in cities than in rural environments. And it even comes with a dose-response relationship for the time someone has grown up in a large city. That means the larger the city you have spent your childhood in, the higher your risk for schizophrenia later on. And it has even been described 2 years ago in Nature that city living is a risk factor with a similar effect size as cannabis consumption for those of you who carry a genetic risk for schizophrenia. A Dutch meta-analysis from 2010, which you see here, describes the urban prevalence of common mental diseases and shows that they are more frequent in average in cities than in rural environments. That means depression, 40% higher risk in cities. Anxiety disorders, 20% higher risk in cities. But interestingly, no difference for substance abuse between urban and rural environments. And this effect even remains stable after controlling for important confounders, which means that this difference that we see between urban and rural is not explained by population characteristics. And this is important evidence pointing towards the causation hypothesis, which means that urbanicity causes mental ill health, as opposed to the selection hypothesis, which means that high-risk individuals rather seek urban environments. But that does still not mean that city living drives us mad or that city living causes mental problems. It rather means that city living interacts with our brains and possibly interacts with psychological, genetical, or social risk factors. Why is this important? It's important because the global population living in cities is growing dramatically. I would even say that urbanization is the global change that mankind is facing within the next decades. I would say even with a similar impact on our health as climate change has. If we look at the figures, we see that by 1950, 1/3 of the global population lived in cities. Today, it's 50%. And by 2050, 2/3 of the worldwide population will live in urban environments. And that is enormous. That is an enormous change occurring on this planet. Of course, the megacities of this world are developing at different paces. If you look at Berlin, which is represented by the green slope here with no significant change from within the decades, you see that Berlin is of course not Shanghai, and Berlin is also not Mumbai. But if we look at larger geographical units, we must say that urbanization is a worldwide phenomenon and going on in all parts of the world. So now, what is it that connects urbanization with our individual stress exposure? Is there something like city-specific stress? And if yes, how does that city stress get under the skin? How does it get virulent? Well, what is stress? Stress is an unspecific physiological or psychological challenge of the organism to a reaction of the organism to a challenge that lies ahead of us. The World Health Organization has declared stress to be one of the largest and most important health challenges of the 21st century. Stress has an enormous impact on our health, on our physical health, and on our mental health. Our stress response is modulated by a variety of factors, such as our personality traits and the subsequent stress coping strategies. Our genes, the way our stress hormones react to stress, and also our living and upbringing conditions, such as whether we are living in an urban or a rural environment. But what does stress mean with regard to cities? What is city-specific stress? I would say it's the combination of social density on the one hand, social isolation on the other hand, which combines to a city-specific social stress. It's clearly shown in biology and in medicine that social density is a constant threat to the social order we live in. Overcrowding and density leads to stress and illness in a variety of species, beginning from insects to rodents and to primates, including humans. Social isolation, on the other hand, is associated with excess mortality, as this meta-analysis shows. An excess mortality that is stronger than the effect of smoking, obesity, and alcohol. Now, how can we understand what happens if that kind of social stress interacts with our brains. A recent study from Mannheim here in Germany nicely contributed to our understanding of stress as a very significant mediator to urban mental health. The authors of this study investigated in a functional brain imaging task participants who lived or had lived in rural environments, in small towns, or in large cities. They were interested in those brain regions which are particularly responsive to urban living. Participants had to fulfill a social stress test in the scanner, which means solving hard arithmetic problems under time pressure with constant negative feedback from the experimenter. Negative feedback like, can you please concentrate a little bit better? You're among the worst individuals that have ever been investigated in this laboratory, and this is really causing problems. So this is social stress in the laboratory. What did they find? Of the activated brain regions, 2 were of particular interest in the context of emotions and stress. The activation of the amygdala, which you see here, a brain region which is important for processing negative emotions and environmental threat. The activation of the amygdala correlated with the size of the city an individual currently resided in. And there was also another region that responded, the cingulate cortex. This is a major part of our limbic stress regulation system in the brain. This region was activated and correlated with the time someone was brought up as a child in a large city. And the coupling between these 2 regions, functional coupling between these 2 regions, was also associated with the time a participant has grown up and spent his childhood in a city. This connection between these 2 regions was reduced in those who had spent most of the times in larger cities, which means in brain biology that their emotion processing and emotional control is somehow reduced. This is interesting against the converging evidence that we have that adverse environmental conditions during childhood severely impact the developing brain and lead to a higher stress vulnerability and proneness to depression as an adult. So what's the consequence of all of these? The consequence of such a study and other studies that we have in this field is not that cities cause mental illnesses per se. Let us be very aware of that. It means that city living interacts with our brains. And if we carry further genetic risks, for example, then the result can be a higher risk for a mental health problem. And why is this? Because city living affects our stress-associated emotional processing. And if we are among those who have further risk factors, then this can have a health impact. Therefore, it's extremely relevant to learn more about the inter-individual differences that city dwellers have with regard to these risk factors. We also must have more information about the different types of health-threatening stressors in the context of city living and how they translate into brain disorders. And of course, we also need more information on the very many stress protective effects that we have in cities. City dwellers have much more better general health care, much better education, better sanitation, etc. And of course, we need to have much more research on the long-term effects of city stressors on the developing brain and on which conditions, living conditions, put our kids particularly at risk in the context of city living. On the action side, what does that mean? Firstly, minimize density in cities and provide room for social contacts in order to reduce stress vulnerability. And also minimize social isolation, particularly in those people who are at higher risk, for example, the older one, to promote their stress resilience and reduce their morbidity risk. And further, and probably most importantly, provide information. Provide information to the public on city stress and how to recover from stress. Provide health information on city stress comparable with the information we provide about the negative effects of smoking or unhealthy food, for example. A time ago, I proposed the term neurourbanism for this context. By neurourbanism, I mean a closer contact and exchange between urban planners, architecture, neuroscientists, and psychiatrists, as well as social sciences, to further and together investigate the neurobiological and psychological consequences of different modes of city living, and also to develop a common metrics that we all could share. We as psychiatrists must learn more about the limits and the options of creating different living environments or housing environments. And on the other hand, urban planners and architects can benefit much better from the neuroscientific methodology we have to measure the health impact and the stress impact of different living conditions. Now, for you, especially for those of you who were among the 5 and higher scores and living in urban environments, we can put it maybe this way: live urban and gain access to the urban advantages that we have, but also be mindful with regard to stress exposure. Thank you very much.